Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jennifer Poulos. I'm the Director of Research for the Rennie Center for Education Research and Policy. We have a goal for this afternoon's conversation, and that is this. We are trying to have a robust conversation about having data influence practice and building better bridges between researchers and educators to ensure more successful students in our public school systems. And we have three great speakers with us this afternoon who I'm very excited to have us help us to this goal. To my immediate right is Jonathan Keller, who's the Senior Associate Commissioner for Research Planning and Information Systems with the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education. Jonathan has been a key player in the development of data sharing agreements among higher education and other agencies, and was a part of the original school to college database leadership team, which won the 2007 Commonwealth Citation for Outstanding Progress. He's been a key player in the Vision Project in DHE's attempt to refine metrics and analysis for that work, and knows much about post-secondary data. So we're very excited to have Jonathan join us. To his right is Dr. David Perda, who's the Chief Accountability Officer for Worcester Public Schools and a key representative of one of our teams here today, sort of wearing two hats for us. In that role, he's responsible for the development and implementation of a district-wide research and evaluation agenda. He provides technical assistance to both central office and school-based staff on the appropriate use of evidence. And before his role with Worcester Public Schools, he was a research scientist at the Institute for Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education, so certainly very well placed to speak about national trends as well. And finally, to his right is Dr. Rich Lapan, a faculty member at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst, a counselor, educator, psychologist, committed to transforming the profession of school counseling from an ancillary support service to a comprehensive program central to the academic and personal development of our students. And recently, in 2006, won the prestigious Counselor Education of the Year Award from the American School Counselor Association. So a very well-placed panel to talk about many of the issues that you all have been grappling with in your team sessions. I'm actually going to go to Dave, to you first, because of that dual hat that you've been wearing in these past 2 days. So Worcester Public Schools, it's known for strong integration of data to make decisions on many aspects of student learning. What's been key for you in doing this and leading others around the table to do the same?
Well, thanks for the question. It's a good question, and I think it's really key to the work that we're about to impart on here. And I'd say the most important thing is beginning to approach questions that are related to program implementation and instruction with a view from that of a researcher or from an evaluator. And I wish I had a nickel for each time the superintendent or some other director at the central office has come to me and they'd say, well, Perda, can you tell me whether or not this program has worked? Is it worth continuing? And it's really hard for me to be able to answer that question because we hadn't put key pieces in place right up front, such as an evaluation plan, such as a plan for gathering data on the extent to which a program has been implemented with fidelity, such as putting key measures in place in a system for gathering that data periodically over the course of program implementation. So you guys are about to enter school districts in the world of school districts, and with Rob Curtin's presentation that he gave this morning, it looks nice and tidy with SIMs and EPIMs and code books. Well, folks, you're entering the world where there are no code books, where there's very little attention to things such as data quality, where data is keyed in by secretaries in schools and it goes into the information management system that resides at the district level. There aren't any reports that go back and forth where principals sign off on the quality of the data. So when you get beyond these things where the state has some quality control systems in place, you really enter the messiness that Scott's been talking about, and you need to deal with that. But I think that this project has potential to not only be useful for the reasons that you all came to hear. You all came here, and I commend you for that, because you're not getting paid for it. You may not even get a publication out of it. It'd be cool if we got some publications out of it, wouldn't it? I think we can. But I really commend you for doing this, because it's exciting, and you've probably sensed some of that excitement already just in meeting with your teams and starting to frame the project and the problem and looking at it through that researcher lens. And I think there's tremendous opportunity to build capacity in the school districts that you're working in, so that long after you're gone, the problems about instruction and about practice are being framed with a lens, so that we can learn from it.
Great. Well, Jonathan, I'm going to go to you next, because Dave said some keywords: data and messiness. And I know that that's a world that you live in almost every day. So in undertaking such a big step forward for the Department of Higher Education in the Vision Project, maybe you can sort of continue that reflection on what's been important, what are some key lessons you've learned, barriers that you've overcome.
Well, and not to sound like a neatness freak, but as tidy as we get, it always seems like it can get tidier. I'll give you a good example. I thought of it during Rob's presentation when he was talking a bit about remedial education, developmental education, as some of you know it. When we get to our institutions that are very autonomous, they each have their own boards, there's really many different types of delivery of remedial education. Right now, in line with a board initiative that's giving campuses the ability to determine in different ways how students are assigned or not assigned or identified as needing remediation. There's many different approaches to determining sort of a college readiness. Is a student ready to take a college level course? So within this realm, we're always sort of shifting around trying to get to the right metric. What's going to tell us what we really need to know? Recently, we've been shifting toward looking at the success in college level math courses and college level English courses. Seems like a relatively clean measure. With enrollment in developmental ed, you can pretty much assume if someone's enrolled in the developmental ed course, they're not college ready, or they're not ready to take whatever that course represents, English, math, reading. However, if they don't enroll, you really don't know. You can have a course that has a lab or a section associated with it that brings that student up to par. So if we're asking the question, are our students ready? We really need to make sure we're looking in the right area. And for me, I think what really gets us to where we need to be is focusing a little bit beyond the data, the tools, to what do we need to know, and how can we make sure we're really understanding it and understand the context around the research questions. So that's been a big issue, I think, with our data merged with elementary and secondary ed, which I think is very exciting. We've worked very hard on it. I joke that the third time's a charm goes doubly for education, because we made 3 tries at the school to college database. The third one, due to a large infusion from the Department of Education, really worked and stuck. We also made a third attempt at our merge that we have now with workforce. We now merge our student records with unemployment insurance records with the labor and workforce development. We can track our students at a student level into the workforce, which is very exciting. We failed twice. On the third time, got it going. So I think sort of patience, a willingness to say, it's not about data dictionaries and tools always. It's sometimes we got to sit back and say, what's really the relevant research question? I think that gets us to where we need to be.
Great. So, Rich, as we move to you, I'm going to pivot a little bit. And that's reflective of your work and how counseling really sort of sits at an important intersection for a lot of students as they accelerate their own success into career choices and college choices. But it's a field that more often than not has been defined by the notion of tracking individual student progress and individual student outcome. So in your work, how do you think about the focus of an institution bringing together academic and non-academic outcomes?
I think it's long overdue. I think this is a very exciting project. And one of the things I've worked for, I was editor of Professional School Counseling, and my work with the American School Counselor Association really tried to talk up the idea about having researchers and practicing counselors come together and try to form partnerships. And very difficult to do. And I'm so terribly impressed by Scott and Chad to be able to do that. I mean, it's really phenomenal, I think. So to be applauded and complimented for sure. So first, as a Massachusetts person, if I could go on, I'd like to thank those of you that have come here from out of state. It's very heartwarming, and I think the students and families are going to be the direct beneficiaries, and we're very, very pleased. I'm so impressed with the people that have come, both as people in high-level skills, and also want to say get to know the school people. We have such good school people in Massachusetts and across the country, and I'm always really proud and to see the high level of skill that they have to be able to promote individual growth and development in the young people that they work with. So, and my, do we live in exciting times, huh? I was thinking about, how many of you have run Lizarol programs? I had one of the first Lizarol programs. Remember putting the equations in? It took me, and being a little dyslexic, I was always getting them backwards and stuff. And I had this hot little Tandy computer, and I'm showing my age. So I finally got my equations in, and I was a study on looking at choice of math science college majors, and had 3-year longitudinal data. And so I pressed the button to start it, and it started going, and 7 hours later it was done. You remember? And then I had a little dot matrix printer, and it was like a little toaster oven going off. It went ding, and then it started going, and all the results came out. That same program now, as you know, takes less than 2 seconds to run. I mean, just like that. And now we have all of this data that, and I really think, I mean, it's really is phenomenal to begin to look at. So a big part of my work has really been focused on implementing quality school counseling programs to ensure that all kids, and I think in the United States we have a variable standard of care when it comes to college and career readiness kinds of counseling, and unfortunately you have this wide variability, and what we want to do is really ensure that all kids get the very best and that there's little deviation from excellence. And I think those are the kinds of things we can start to measure and find ways. Got to take a results-oriented approach myself in terms of, then using the data to make informed decisions and getting better at what we do. So I'd like to add just a couple things, if I could, 2 challenges that I see. One is that as a researcher, I'm constantly and painfully reminded when I'm dealing with counselors, and it's like we live in sort of different data dimensions. So I recently finished a study with a large school district out west, a nice hierarchical linear modeling, multi-level analysis, 20,000 students, 28 schools, and I remember I was so excited to talk to people about how I got this interaction effect, and you could just see the blank look. It's like, what in the world are you talking about? Why is that important to us? So I think that where I would go with this is that we need to translate whatever data that we're collecting into meaningful results and content that schools and teachers and counselors and families and kids can use. So for example, it's that kind of, the argument for quality. Why do we have quality preschool? Well, for every $1 you spend on it, you get $7 in return, right? Isn't that been the Obama administration argument about that? And when I was at the University of Missouri for a number of years with Dr. Norm Geispers, if you're familiar in the school counseling, we figured out at one point, made an estimate, that we really want counselors out of the business of doing non-guidance tasks like copying things and spending time with students doing good college and career planning. Okay. So we figured out that in Missouri, if you started doing non-guidance tasks on January 1 and just thought how many days it would take, when do you think, in terms of the percentage of time that counselors spend on that, that they would actually be done with all the non-guidance tasks for the whole year? Any guess? Well, we figured it was almost April 1st, almost April Fool's Day. That it took that long because that much of their time was devoted. And that seems to be a sort of a meaningful chunk that someone can get a hold of. I worked with a school district in Milwaukee, and we figured out they did a mentoring advisory program, and they had a 2% increase in an average daily attendance. And so we thought, well, what are the good things about that? Well, there's all kinds of good things. Well, one of the good things about that is that it increased the state revenue, that the income that came into the school. So they earned close to $50,000. And that $50,000 was enough to actually hire a full-time counselor. So I mean, so I think it's important to take the numbers and then to put them into things that really capture people's imagination, because then we're in the business, as Keith Westridge has been so good about, thinking about how do we advocate for the kind of funding that we need to be able to do this kind of work. Last thing, if I don't mean to take up too much time, but I would like to say, also, I would encourage you as a team to think about when you're working with districts. I think you'll get a lot more traction if whatever you do, the school people can use it for multiple purposes and multiple outcomes, sort of like one stone killing several birds at the same time. And in Massachusetts, we have some very exciting things and difficult things. How many of you, if you've heard about district-determined measures, the educators are under pressure and are being held accountable to have district-determined measures. Are you having an impact? SMART goal development. Developing a professional development plan, educator evaluation. We encourage counselors to go in front of, to make presentations to school boards about what they're up to. So by taking this data, so you can package it in a way with your projects that they can do all of those things. So it accomplishes a lot of things. So it's not, as someone was saying at the last meeting, it's not another add-on that in fact, it actually helps you do a lot of things all at the same time.
So I want to, Dave, go to you next and pull forward sort of two themes that got a lot of nods from the audience when Rich spoke. First is this notion of translating data to an English-speaking audience. That maybe sounds a little pejorative, but nonetheless, probably strikes a few chords in the room. And this notion of no more add-ons, right? How to sort of think through the integration of data into decision-making with data you already have. And I'm sensing that you must think about this a lot on a daily basis, is sort of your role of getting out with school leaders and teachers and doing both, and maybe doing both at the same time. So maybe you could share a little perspectives as to what have been some of the secrets to your success.
Well, I think those are both great questions. I'll take the second one first about the add-ons, because it's something you hear from all the time when you talk to district and school personnel. And it's been going on for a while, but I think a lot of it really took hold with the Race to the Top initiative, and it came at a time where the economy was really bad, and school districts and states really had no choice but to accept the strings that were attached to Race to the Top. So down the road came these initiatives, and I think educators have become a little bit numb to this thing that they call initiative churn, and that these things come and go, and it'll come and it will pass, and give them what they want and maybe they'll go away. So I think our approach to that in Worcester is to do what Richard said, and is, okay, so there are some things here that we have to do, but before we take on the have to do's, let's think about what we really want to do, and to listen to folks, and not to have Superintendent Boone come into a building full of counselors and say, look, this is what we're going to do, but to say, look, what do you guys think are the problems? Our hands are tied somewhat with respect to resources, so we can't do everything that we want to do, but let's talk about what you think really needs to be addressed. And we've used some of the school counselor surveys that are available on the website over at UMass-Amherst to kind of get a lay of the land from our guidance counselors, for example, about some of the issues that they face. And in Worcester, as we've been talking about in our group, our demographic profile of our student population has changed exponentially in the last 20 years. We have lots of English language learners. We've gone from being a white student majority to being a Hispanic student majority. And when you talk to guidance counselors, their job has also changed, and that's because the kids are showing up and they're not ready to learn. They haven't had a good breakfast. They don't have a coat on their back. And so focusing on college and career readiness, they're not ready for that because they need to do things that we'd normally would think that adjustment counselors would take on, but we don't have enough of those either. So it's become this little bit of a trickle-down effect, and they felt that. So listening to folks, collecting data, analyzing that data, and putting in a plan over many years and prioritizing things has worked for us. Your first question, could you repeat it, was about?
Translation.
Translation of data. That's another big topic, and we've talked about that in our group. I do lots of sharing data, and I try to get, we spend all this time collecting data, and it's just amazing, a school district the size of Worcester Public Schools with 25,000 students, how much data we just need to collect just to keep this operation going. Getting kids from the bus stop to the schools, getting kids a lunch on their plate. It's amazing that school districts are able to pull this off. It blows my mind. But as a researcher, we're able to tap into this data to answer interesting questions, and being in the district, we also have the power to collect more. But we have a responsibility to not inundate neither students or staff with data collection, and that can be a big problem, and which is why a lot of times if you send in a research application into my office, you get the rejection stamp on it, because it's taking people away from what we're trying to do, which is to educate students. But when we do collect data, we have a responsibility to get it back to people who are in position to make a difference in kids' lives. And if you stay on top of the K-12 sort of literature, the stuff you see in Ed Week and the popular journals like that, there's been this data-driven schools movement over the last 15 years. Use the data, all the answers are there. And that's all well and good, and obviously, being a researcher and you guys sort of probably believe that to some extent. But the thing is with working with data is the more you work with data, the more you realize that you don't know what you're doing and that you need to learn more. And this is why we go back to graduate school and we learn more advanced techniques, and we learn about what happens when the data are missing. Does it introduce biases into the analyses? And I think by and large, school districts don't have that level of sophistication when it comes to data analysis. We're pretty good at looking at descriptive data, the kinds of stuff you can get on Edwin and the tools that are available on the website. But once we get down into that student level analysis, or once we get down into that level where school districts are gathering their own data, it gets messy quick, and you need a trained professional, and these point and click tools aren't always the answer. So I think this model where we have partnerships in taking some of the work off the plate of people who have my position in districts, I think is a great model that has a lot of potential. So
Jonathan, I'm going to go to you next. And it's an interesting conundrum that not only Dave has sort of tipped us off to, but probably much of the conversation over the last day and a half. So we're here to talk about college and career readiness, thinking about how we best prepare Massachusetts public school students for success in college and certainly after college in the workforce. But a lot of the indicators that we use to talk about college skills and acquisition of college skills still come from K-12 data. So maybe you could speak a little bit from the pivot point at the Department of Higher Education about some of the post-secondary indicators that you look most critically at. And when you think about sort of that need to sort of continue to build bridges, maybe not between researcher and practitioners, Dave queued up, but here between high school and college.
It's a good question. I think I mentioned some of it when I first spoke with regard to looking at the completion of college level coursework.
So that would be when you all think about that, maybe some of the MICCR.
No, I'm sorry, once they enter.
Once they enter.
Enter
okay.
higher education, yeah. I'm sorry, instead of looking necessarily, though in addition to more, whether they enroll in a developmental ed course, because as I mentioned, that may or may not trigger whether or not someone was college ready, focus on what happens once they get to the point of taking a college level gateway, sometimes as they call it, course in math or English or reading. Were they successful in that course? I still think, and this gets to, I think, digging deeper, realizing what you know and what you don't know. It really pays to kind of interact with the schools, get a broader sense of implementation knowledge, how are different delivery programs implemented on the campuses. There's some quote, I don't know it's attributed to, that data are not information. Information is not knowledge. Knowledge is not understanding. I would also say understanding is not implementation. It's, you know, you always need something more to get to each level. And, you know, you might want to know, was there a component of a college level course where an individual teacher or a actual specified section was out there to help students who weren't quite college ready? But I do think we provide, I don't want to dismiss the data and information we have. Several folks, and I was talking with Dave and Rich about this earlier, were asking about the NSC data, you know, and everyone receives it and very excited about it. But think about the NSC data with what we have to offer as well, which is, you know, were they degree-seeking students? I mean, students are entering into higher education with no intent to go on for a college degree. You don't necessarily want to see them dropping out as a dropout. It could be a stop out, it could be they received what they wanted, especially I think in the realm of community colleges where things I think get very complex because there are really a broad array of success outcomes for community colleges. You can also, you know, look at whether they're full-time or part-time. What's the appropriate length of time you want to assess whether a student should have graduated within this time frame. You could look at their majors, you could look at their course outcomes, you could see whether or not they took a developmental course, whether they passed their college level course. You could look at financial aid issues. So we can get to a much more refined picture of what's happening. But as I said, I think it could always get tidier, it can always get more enhanced. I would love to see kind of a second round of Department of Education grant where we're trying to really dig even deeper into answering the specific research questions that you have and make sure we have the level of data understanding that's necessary to address those research questions.
So more disaggregation.
More disaggregation and more, I'd say almost purposeful disaggregation. How are we measuring it, you know, and are we measuring it appropriately for the types of research questions that are being asked?
Great. So Rich, this is going to be our sort of summative question, if you will, and I ask you to sort of bring us back to where you started, which is all about the importance of partnerships, especially between researchers and practitioners or researchers and educators, because that's really our purpose over this day and a half. So what have you observed in terms of effective practice and how those two parties need to come together, especially around a set of data, to be able to sort of make decisions and all in the vested interest of better student learning, better student outcomes, and of course, college and career readiness?
Thanks. I mean, I think there's a lot of research out there. I think we have to use it. And I think if you take a holistic perspective on the research that's out there and from a holistic perspective on the individual person, the student, what you can find is that, you know, I have three major areas to really focus on. Obviously, academic achievement and indicators of those being, you know, SAT, ACT kinds of scores. When you're looking at post-secondary success, retention, GPA, graduating on time, that explains about what, 25% of the variance, if I'm not mistaken. At least I would argue from the EdPsych research and from counseling psychology research as well. When you then add in motivation and self-regulation skills, there's that value-added side that comes to it. So you end up with the kind of work that Dr. Tim Erden does. You explain an additional, what, 8% of the variances. So now you're up to 33% or so. And then when you take career development in, and when you add that in kind of in a value-added multiple regression kind of way, you again find that it has a single and unique bang for its buck. I mean, it explains an additional 3 to 5% of the variance. So now you're close to about 40% of the variance, which is a lot. So I think we do ourselves a disservice when we only look at just sort of one part of the person. We need to take the social emotional side into account, as well as the critical career development pieces, as well as all the kind of organizational, all the soft skills, which unfortunately I think we need to come up with a new name for those, because I would think those turn out to be the most important sides of it. So I think that's awfully important. And I'd like to go back to something that you were saying. I think if we stay the course, and not move away from it, there's way too much evidence that would suggest that good things will happen for children and their families if we go down this path. And given what Gerald Chertavian was talking about, there are real consequences for not doing this. And so I would say, I would encourage us to stick it out.
Great. So you've heard some high-level reflections from our panelists. We now want to spend the majority of our time together, the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, posing questions. Despite their very high-level comments and high-level reflections, these are three gentlemen who have worked deep with data. So I would encourage you, if you have specific questions, specific challenges that you're working on in your team conversations, to don't hesitate to and pose them. So let's open up the floor. Ben, do you want to lead us off?
Sure. I'm curious because we've been very interested in the labor market data and looking what happens to the graduates when they leave either high schools or post-secondary institutions. We haven't seen it. And I wonder what it looks like, especially when you trace it back to communities like our gateway cities. You know, if you compare a gateway city ninth grader to a gateway city, or to a ninth grader somewhere else in Massachusetts, we know, you know, they don't go on to college at anywhere near the same rate. But when they do go on to college, is there as much variation in the outcomes? Are there the wages they earn much different than other college graduates?
Well, I should say that we've done a lot of analyses with the match between higher education and the workforce. We did, in our work with the Edwin Analytics projects, talk about the possibility of putting together a tool where we look at going all the way back to what high schools did they come from through their college experience into workforce, which we're very excited about. It ended up, just I think in terms of grant funds diminishing and scope, it just wasn't in the scope of the project, and we haven't done that yet ourselves. It's all possible because we do have this merged database, so we could look at, you know, different areas, different pockets geographically, look at different districts, and see what happened to students who went into our publics and then went into the workforce. I will say with the match data, it's been really phenomenal. We've seen some really amazing outcomes, especially in the health and STEM areas, where if you take into account some of the limitations of the data, and, you know, I always think back to when I was working on my PhD dissertation. I had I feel like I had a dissertation this long and a statement of limitations that was this long. And then when I got into my work in I worked for Arizona Board of Regents, was my first higher ed work, and then in Wisconsin, the last thing they want to see is the limitations. They just want to see this part. But I mean, there are some limitations in terms of we don't right now get people who get work out of state and some other earnings and field limitations. But with certain really gross outcomes that are really tremendous, we could see that, especially in areas like nursing, it's looking like we almost have 100% employment at really high earnings levels. It's very exciting, you know, analyses, and we can really track and see who seems to get into, you know, solid employment in the Commonwealth. So I'm really excited about it. I'd like to go to that direction you're talking about. We just haven't gotten there yet.
Can I add to that?
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, well, two things. I'm not sure if this gets at what you're saying, Ben, but I looked at some IES data a while back, and what I was struck with is about 40 to 45% of all people with a 4-year college degree, now 5 years after they graduate, 40 to 45% were reported that they were not in a career direction that they were going to go towards for the long haul. So it's, you know, after you spend your $200,000, not having a career focus. I mean, I think that seems to me. The second one, I think the Forgotten Half second report just came out, and what they're talking about is that, you know, getting people into post-secondary is one thing, but actually being successful in graduating, and really not good economic outcomes for, if I'm reading this correctly, for those people who just are taking courses and then drop out.
Mm-hmm.
So some real, some real significant.
The large population of some college, no degree.
No degree.
Right.
Right.
But Jonathan, did you look at subgroups of the graduates? So
We did. We did. What we do with the merge is we front load it with all of our variables in terms of demographics. We like K-12, we have a proxy for lower income, which is looking at whether they're eligible for Pell while they're in higher education. We added that in there, and other variables, especially focusing on the degree program they were in.
Yeah.
And then, so we were able to.
Within degree programs by subgroup, like would an African American or Latino student in the same degree program have a big wage difference when they graduate?
We haven't looked at that. We're still in the early stages of it, I will say. As I mentioned, the third time's a charm thing. We failed legally once, we failed legally twice, then we got it. But what we've done basically is look primarily at the differentials with regard to degree program, institution, and region, and then look at earnings as well as employment over a period of quintiles.
Other questions? Why don't we go in the back? Yes, with the mic.
Yes, thank you. So this is more of a suggestion for a new soft skills term. The human resources community distinguishes between the technical skills and the performance skills. So you have the technical skills, what are you doing? Performance skills is how do you do it? That's just, I know Keith also had mentioned yesterday that that there needs to be a change in that term. More of a comment than a question. So,
Thank you. Thank you for that.
I like the term, I don't know, workforce readiness behaviors, because then because it gets all the, you better be able to get along with people, you better show up on time, all of those kinds of things.
do a survey.
Other questions? I saw a few more hands. Yes. Do you want to wait? The mic is right there if you want to wait for it.
Thanks. This is, I think, mostly probably a question for Rich. One of the things that I've been wondering about is the critical role that school counselors can play, especially in guidance towards college and career readiness. But I often hear about counselors really getting pulled out of the sort of one-on-one counseling role and into a lot more, I don't know, administrative or record collecting role. I was just wondering if there's much data about how much time counselors get to spend counseling, and if how much that varies by maybe the needs level of the schools.
Great question.
The answer is yes. We know very clearly ratios matter, and then what counselors do with their time matters. And I have some data I could share with you looking at discipline and incidence rates where counselors are allowed to do kind of college and career readiness kinds of work. We did a study of the Chicago Public Schools, which is on our Ronald Frederickson Center for School Counseling Outcome Research. It's a little shameless plug for that. But I could show you in the Chicago Public Schools, as the percentage of students on free and reduced lunch increases in schools, what you can see is the counselors' use of their time doing non-guidance tasks increases. So the very populations that are the neediest and really could use, I think the challenges would be the counselors are, they're doing discipline kinds of things, they're doing a lot of special education work, they're doing copying work, they're doing administrivia kinds of tasks, and how to free counselors time up. That's a critical thing, is how to reduce that time. So if you look at the Massachusetts model for comprehensive school counseling, and they ask the national model for school counseling, they really try to be very clear about ratios as well as how counselors would be able to divide up their time. And I think it's really critical for school leaders, principals, and superintendents and school boards to start to say, no, we want our counselors actually doing counseling work. We need this college and career counseling, and that this is a central thing, and there's consequences for young people when they don't get these kinds of skills. And their families too. Financial aid and financial planning, we have to do better than just a MIFA night, a Massachusetts Ed Finance Authority night, and they would say that about how do you, with my colleague Tim Poyton, we've looked at financial planning strategies that young people, as they're leaving Massachusetts high schools, and there you find very distinctive kinds of strategies, and that what we would be pushing for would be counselors to take a real heterogeneous approach and say what works for which particular kinds of groups. Because one of the things we found is that, and we had 16 high schools, and 25% of the sample, at least 25% of a sample in each of those high schools, these were graduating seniors, they had really no plans for how they were going to, they were almost planless, and we labeled them the 13th graders because there was like this lack of ownership in terms of how they were going to move towards the future, that, they'd be going to another year of school, but they really didn't have much of a plan for what they were going to do or how they were going to pay for it.
Interesting.
So, Rich, just quickly then, but when you said that when they did less administrative, but the idea of school counseling maybe just also describes that some of the things to leverage college career readiness isn't one-on-one counseling.
Oh, yeah. Well,
okay,
thanks,
so maybe
yeah.
you could just talk about what seems to be the emerging role of the school counselor.
And a great question. So for at least the last 30 years, there's been a strong movement across the United States and in other countries as well to change really to transform school counseling. So it's much more of a whole school approach. So we want counselors to go in and do guidance curriculum kinds of activities, small group advisories. My colleagues, I think, can attest. There's a lot of research that would suggest that small group work is at least as effective, if not more effective. And so that it's a better use of counselors' time to be doing group work as opposed to individual sides of it. So it's much more about development and prevention. We would take a whole K through 12 kind of perspective, and that elementary, this is the kind of work. Aspirations and expectations, if you think the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, stereotype threat, I'm not a math person. When does that happen? That's about third grade, right? That's a career development issue. That's something that counselors should be involved in, so teachers should be involved in, parents should be involved in, but not so if you have Naviance or career cruising or the different products, you wouldn't take a student one-on-one the whole class at a time, but you could do career classes and you could work it into the academic. Some of the work I've done too is taking the career piece and integrating it into the curriculum. So we did a study in a high school or actually middle school 7th graders, and taking a look at the English language curriculum and how you can connect that into the career work. So in terms of the kinds of common core standards that you're looking at, reflective practice and writing, and we have some very interesting data how predictive those are of MCAS scores as well. And I think that's a great point, Scott. There's a lot of work that would look at and has argued for the value-added side to this, so that when you add in the relevance side, the kind of the relevance and personal connections, you find that people, there's been a whole number of studies that have found gains in academic achievement, so that it's a value-added argument for that.
We have time for one last brief question. Any takers? Well, then, please join me in thanking our panelists.